If you walk into the ancient Medinas of Tunisia without a map, you'll get completely lost. But in the 9th century, this confusion was a matter of life and death, as these aren't just vibrant tourist streets, they are heavily fortified military machines built to survive brutal navy sieges, Spanish armadas and pirate raids. So today we are going inside the medieval maze of Sousse Medina, using my real family's journey to uncover the dark, raw history of how people actually lived, fought and died inside these walls. Now, when we first visited the Medina in Sousse, we came in from the south side nearer the sea by first crossing the main road and then walking through this arch-like structure in this garden. And as we made our way in the Medina, it didn't really seem all that busy, but we were out of season when we visited in January. But one of the first things that we actually noticed, which was something that you see everywhere in Tunisia, and that is cats. Now, on the right-hand side as we entered, there was this local lady who was going about feeding them outside her shop, which actually was really nice to see. Then just past this on the left, you come to the Great Mosque of Sousse, which is set in this like open square, you know, with trees at the front. And from the outside, I gotta be honest, it didn't really strike me as a mosque, as it had no like tower and minaret, and it looked exactly like a defensive castle, you know, kind of like matching the rugged military architecture that was actually around it. Now, there was a major historical reason for this layout. The mosque was built in 851 AD by the order of this particular person, and was also built years before the fortified walls you see around the Medina today. Then, with Sousse being sat right on the exposed Mediterranean coastline, it was constantly vulnerable to Christian Byzantine naval raids. As if pirates actually breached the harbour, the mosque then had to double as a citadel. So the inner walls are lined with battlements and the two corner towers were built as fortified watchposts. As back in the 800s, the citizens wouldn't just come here to pray, they would retreat inside these thick stone walls with weapons to actually defend their lives. We also got to go inside just before the afternoon cut-off time, and we were actually greeted by the gentleman who told us he had been looking after the mosque for over 30 years, and that this was his final year before retirement. He was incredibly welcoming, and we were only charged a few pounds for a family of 4 to actually enter. He also gave my wife and daughter dresses and headscarf, you know, to cover up, with my daughter actually really enjoying the experience, as putting on the headscarf and the dress kind of like really felt like it was part of it. Now, as we walked around the square courtyard, the gentleman came over to speak with us. You know, he gave us a breakdown of the building itself and explained the role of women in the faith, while they had their own dedicated door and separate prayer room. He also explained about the call to prayer 5 times a day, noting that everyday work and human life are respected, so people don't always need to drop everything to attend the mosque. Now, you could tell he was deeply proud of his 30-year role here, though he did share a personal note about how he always wanted to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca, but had never been able to afford it. But learning from a local caretaker completely changes how you actually look at this space. Because when you look closely at the architecture of the Great Mosque, because the city walls weren't actually built until 859 AD, this mosque was completely exposed to the sea. It had to be engineered as its own independent fort. The interior design is incredibly simple yet rugged, but the history behind the stones is actually quite brutal, as Sousse was a main naval launch pad for this particular dynasty, who went on conquest in the Mediterranean. And during this particular famous siege in 870 AD, their armies completely ransacked Malta, with historical records actually showing that columns and marble from Malta's destroyed Christian buildings were actually shipped right back across the water to Sousse to help fortify the city's new mosques and palaces. So when you actually look at these ancient structures, you're actually looking at the raw spoils of a medieval holy wars. Now, once you leave the mosque out the same door, you can walk straight across the square to the Sousse Minaret, which was actually built around 30 years before this particular mosque. But we chose not to actually go there, as we had plans to actually see the bigger one in Monastir. Now, we carried on following the road into the very heart of the Medina. Now, this is where it completely changes, as the moment you clear the mosque walls, you see local kids playing football along the stone walkway, and there are these little shops that are packed tightly together, and with that it gets a lot busier, with people walking about. You know, you have mopeds riding right up the tight narrow streets. Walking here, you feel like you really are somewhere entirely out of the way. You have most shopkeepers who are basically sitting outside or waiting in doorways, and will always greet you immediately by asking you to come inside inside and have a look around. Now, we only walked down a few streets and visited some shops, but straight away our first impression was just how, disorientating it actually is, as there are so many small roads and walkways that you could easily wander around for hours. But feeling completely lost in this area is because these commercial streets were mapped out all the way back in 859 AD, and back then none of these buildings were originally shops. As when this particular dynasty designed this grid layout, these streets were strictly fortified residential quarters for Islamic soldiers and their families. Each lane was lined with plain, windowless stone houses designed to actually keep the garrison safe. Now, it wasn't actually until centuries later, around the 13th or 14th centuries, under this particular dynasty, that Sousse's maritime trade actually exploded. And to handle the massive influx of merchant ships trading olive oil, grains and textiles across the Mediterranean, the locals literally carved open the front of their homes. They converted the residential living rooms into tightly packed cave-like storefronts that you actually see today. They divided the streets into specialised souks, one lane strictly for leather, another one for carpets, and then another one for metals. So when you're actually dodging mopeds and talking to shopkeepers today, you're actually walking through what actually used to be a highly secure 19th century military barracks that's actually turned into a medieval shopping mall. Now, on our second visit, we had a completely different experience. Now, if you enter from the south, you get like these endless shops and tourist cafes, but from the north side is a quiet residential area. Now, to get there, we actually walked along the outside of the Medina walls, which is where you get a massive contrast between the old and the new. Now, following the path from the south, you first pass a shared taxi cab service that's always seemed incredibly busy. Then you follow a beautiful, well-maintained stone walkway lined with grass and these tall standing palm trees. Now, this walk lets you take in massive fortified walls which have been standing for hundreds of years, which are incredibly grand and very well looked after, along with the old lookout towers that have been stationed along the loops to keep the Medina safe from historic attacks. And it's a complete contrast to the other side of the street, which is actually lined with these modern residential buildings and tall blocks of flats. It really showcases like the modern side of Tunisia. But standing right next to these stones also gives you like a real sense of scale, as this massive perimeter wall was constructed all the way back in 859 AD. And to build it, medieval engineers used massive blocks of local yellow limestone, stacking them to a height of over 8 meters. But unlike modern buildings, these walls are completely solid stone with dirt inside, and engineered specifically to actually absorb the heavy impact of battering rams without ever collapsing. And with those lookout towers also that I noticed along our walk being used as the core of the city's defensive strategy, because they stick out past the main wall and it gave guards a clear line of sight to shoot arrows or rain down heavy rocks on the flanks of any enemy trying to place ladders against the ramparts. As back in the Middle Ages, the moment enemy fleet was actually spotted on the horizon, a trumpet would sound from these very towers. The farmers and families living in the open countryside would run for their lives through the massive gates into the city. Now, once you're inside, the heavy wooden doors would be barred shut and the entire Medina effectively became an impenetrable stone island. Which is wild to think that this peaceful walkway we enjoyed was once a brutal military perimeter where the survival of the entire population was decided. Now, we entered from the very north into the residential district, which was significantly quieter than the commercial south side. And with that, it gives you like a real look into how locals live inside these ancient walls today. We were first greeted by a lady who was working by sweeping the streets just inside the Medina walls. And as we walked further in, the streets tightened into these little tiny like alleys. But these tiny alleys are actually a masterclass in urban warfare, as if an enemy army actually breached the perimeter walls, they wouldn't find a wide main road to march down. The streets were intentionally built like this claustrophobic maze to actually act as a physical choke point. They are too narrow, for cavalry charges, and they completely broke up the formation of invading soldiers, splitting them up into smaller groups. Now, worse still for the invaders, the houses were actually built with flat roofs with very few exterior windows. Now, this meant that local defenders could move invisibly across the rooftops, raining down heavy stones, arrows, or even boiling oil onto the trapped soldiers below, which made invading this residential quarters an absolutely suicidal mission. What's also fascinating is almost every building is pure white, contrasted with these unique, vibrantly coloured doors and windows, as the materials of these homes tell the story of a survival against the Tunisian climate. These buildings are constructed from a thick stone, masonry and brick, and they're actually covered in lime wash, which is a natural breathable plaster made from crushed limestone and water. Now, they have been painted white exactly like this since the medieval era for the highly practical reason that the white lime actually reflects the intense North African sun, keeping the inside of the unair conditioned homes remarkably cool in the scorching summer. But the doors and windows are where the architecture actually gets deeply personal. The elaborate wooden window screens you see are designed so that families inside could actually look out onto the street and catch the Mediterranean breeze, whilst also remaining completely invisible to people walking by outside, preserving total privacy. Also, the colours aren't random either, as historically families used natural pigments to actually paint their woodwork. The iconic sea blue, which became famous along the coast, was chosen because it softens the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the white walls. And now there's also a local folklore that also claims it helps repel mosquitoes. Now, the green doors traditionally symbolise Islam and paradise, while the yellow reflected the surrounding desert, and the metal studs that you actually see hammered into the wood are actually protective talisman, laid out in geometric shapes to actually bring good luck and ward off evil from the household. But here we just, basically saw people going about their everyday lives, walking to and from houses or even heading off to work. And of course we ran into the famous cats again. Some were just, wandering the streets or chilling outside houses, while the hungry ones were actually digging through litter that had been left behind. But as we wandered and marred in the surroundings, we were constantly checking our sat-navs to actually see where we were, because many of these tiny little alleys actually led to dead ends where you actually basically have to turn around and backtrack. Now, eventually we came to a street that opened up into a row of shops and local places to eat. Now, we decided to stop at this particular place because on the outside of the building it was incredibly striking, with white walls covered in these bright yellow artwork. Now, this actually did turn out to be the best meal experience of our trip. They take you all the way to the very top floor, giving these amazing views right over the Medina rooftops and out to sea. Now, whilst we were actually sitting there waiting for our traditional dishes to arrive, the call of prayer suddenly began. And what we hadn't realised was there was actually a mosque sitting directly right next door to the restaurant. So sitting up here looking out over Tunisia with the sound echoing right next to us was a completely unique experience. Now, there are other museums inside the walls that you can visit, but we decided to leave them to allow us time to see more things in the area. But walking through these streets gave us a true sense of what the old Tunisian looked like, and it was something that I'm really glad that we actually did. Now, the Sousse Medina isn't a museum frozen in time, for tourists. It really is a living, breathing fortress where 9th century military engineering actually meets modern 21st century families. It's a place where you can get completely lost in a maze of silent residential alleys, only to turn a corner and find yourself, basically in a roaring market, or listen to a call of prayer that hasn't changed since the Middle Ages. So if you're planning a trip to Tunisia, don't just, stay behind the gates, of your beach resort. Take the time, to step through these ancient stone archways, turn off your map for a little while and experience the living history for yourself.